The fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps trapped in plastic. Cedar Creek Medical's ICU hummed with the steady rhythm of machines that never slept, and Brooke Sullivan moved through it like water finding its level, present but unnoticed, efficient but invisible. Her scrubs were navy blue, standard issue, the same color worn by 100 other nurses in Denver that morning. Nothing about her stood out. That was precisely the point. She arrived at 0555, 12 minutes before shift change, the parking lot still dark enough that the sodium lights cast everything in sickly orange. Her 2004 Honda Civic blended perfectly with the staff lot, no bumper stickers, no vanity plates, nothing that would catch a second glance from anyone running a background check. 8 months she'd been at Cedar Creek. 8 months of keeping her head down, her voice soft, her competence carefully measured so it never threatened anyone above her on the hierarchy. 8 months of monitoring room 347. The ICU doors slid open with a hydraulic sigh. The smell hit her first, that familiar cocktail of antiseptic, stale coffee, and the metallic undertone of blood that never quite washed away from the linoleum. Her nostrils flared once. Information. Pain was information, and so was every other sensation. She'd learned that in Tikrit. She used it now. Morning, Brooke, the night charge nurse called from the central station, barely looking up from discharge paperwork. Sarah, kind woman, 3 kids, worked nights to avoid her ex-husband. They'd had coffee exactly once, and Brooke had learned not to make it twice. Friendships left traces, and traces could compromise missions. Morning, Brooke replied, her voice pitched low and flat, the vocal signature of someone who'd learned to occupy a room without taking up space. She moved past the nurse's station toward the supply cabinet, her posture slightly rounded, shoulders inward, the physical language of deference. Captain Sullivan didn't exist here. Here was just Brooke, a competent nurse from some unspecified military hospital background that nobody asked about because military spouses took jobs everywhere and nobody cared. Room 347 was at the end of the corridor, third window on the left. She could see the light still on inside, the blue glow of the heart monitor casting shadows across the white walls. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Webb lay in that bed, blind since the IED took his vision in Sanjin Valley 2 years after she'd carried him to the medevac in Tikrit. He didn't know she was the one who'd done it. He didn't know the voice reading his vitals every morning belonged to the woman who'd screamed his name across 400 meters of hell while rounds punched the dirt around them. She passed his room first, just a glance through the window. His left arm lay across the blanket, and there it was, her name, tattooed in black ink with the precision of a field hospital artist working by lamplight in a medical tent at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center. Sullivan. Below it, the faded unit patch from 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. A commemoration of the day she'd grabbed him by the body armor and dragged him toward the sound of rotors, his blood soaking through her uniform while she counted her steps. 1, 2, 3, 40, 80, 137. Until the Black Hawk landed and she could hand him off to someone else. She'd kept her own copy of that patch sewn inside her jacket lining. Field stitch, tight and precise, the kind of stitching that held things together when everything was coming apart. She touched it now, her fingers brushing the fabric as she passed the break room, a habit so practiced it barely registered anymore. The patch was her tether. It was also her trap. The full line in room 347 was running low. Brooke noted it with the clinical precision that made her dangerous, a precision that had nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with combat medicine in a trauma tent where you had to move fast and move right or people died. She pulled the new bag from the supply cart, checked the label, and moved into his room with a kind of economical efficiency that made every movement count. Morning, Gunnery Sergeant Webb, she said, her voice carefully modular, all professional warmth with no undertone of recognition. The mask was perfect. It always was. Morning, he replied, his head turning slightly toward the sound of her voice. His sightless eyes were fixed on the middle distance, a habit he'd developed since the blast took his vision. Pale blue eyes, direct and intelligent, the kind of eyes that had probably seen too much even before the IED. Now they saw nothing at all. How's the morning looking? Quiet, Brooke said, which was true. She moved to the forestand with practiced grace, her hands finding the connection points without looking. 14 years of nursing, though only 8 months of it here. Before that, combat medicine. Before that, a life she couldn't talk about and wouldn't remember if she could. How's the pain this morning? 7 out of 10, Webb said. Better than yesterday. That morphine adjustment you made was good. She'd made no morphine adjustment. The night nurse had done that. But Webb associated her voice with care, with competence, with the only stability in his days. He'd latched onto her without knowing why. People did that sometimes. They recognized something in you even when you were wearing a mask so perfect it had become your real face. The 4 bag changed with 3 quick movements. Spike the new bag. Disconnect the old line. Reconnect. The kind of procedure a trained nurse could do in 40 seconds. Brooke did it in 38, her movements like a machine tooled by someone who'd performed the same task under far worse conditions. Under fire. Under rain. Under the weight of decisions that made mortality calculations simple mathematics. 1 liter of Ringer's lactate at 200 milliliters per hour. She could do the math in her sleep. Your breakfast should be here in about 20 minutes, she said, adjusting the flow rate. Scrambled eggs today, I think. Toast. Coffee if you want it. That sounds good, Webb said. You know, you remind me of someone I knew once. A long time ago. Brooke's hands didn't freeze. Her breathing didn't change. The mask stayed perfect. But something cold moved down her spine, the reptilian brain recognizing danger even as the trained mind suppressed the reaction. Is that right? She said neutrally, checking the monitor readings. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure 130/84. O2 saturation 98%. Perfect. Yeah, Webb said, and there was something like longing in his voice now. This woman. Captain Sullivan. She was the one who pulled me out when everything went to hell. She got me to the bird. I never saw her face, obviously. He lifted his left arm, the one with the tattoo. But I knew her voice. Even now. Some voices you never forget. Brooke looked at the tattoo for exactly 1 second. Her name in black ink, preserved forever on his skin as a reminder of a debt he thought he could never repay. She'd done the same thing he had, kept the memory sealed inside her body. Inside her jacket lining. Inside the part of her that still belonged to a war she couldn't talk about. That sounds like someone worth remembering, Brooke said. Her voice was still level, still soft, still perfectly unremarkable. The composure held. It always did. She finished the forecheck and was turning toward the door when the elevator chimed down the hallway. That sound meant incoming. Someone important, someone expected. The nurses at the central station would straighten their spines. Someone was coming through. Brooke stepped into the hallway and held the door half-closed behind her. She was still within sight of the central station but not close enough to be part of the conversation. That was where she'd learned to position herself, visible but not present, close enough to know what was happening but far enough away that no one would think to include her. The elevator doors opened, and Dr. Marcus Mercer stepped out like a man stepping onto a yacht he owned. Italian shoes, polished enough to see your face in. Tailored slacks. A white coat that probably cost more than Brooke's monthly mortgage. He was 53, Harvard Medical School, chief of surgery at Cedar Creek, which meant he owned the place in every way that mattered. His hands looked soft. His nails were manicured. He had the kind of face that belonged to a man who'd never made a decision that kept him awake at night. He moved toward the ICU like he owned it, and technically, he did. Brooke watched him come, her face carefully neutral, her body language still slightly rounded. Just a nurse. Just someone who moved through the hospital like a ghost, helping where help was needed, speaking only when spoken to. Dr. Mercer paused at the nurse's station, and Sarah looked up quickly, offering the kind of smile that people reserve for the powerful. "Morning, Dr. Mercer." "Sarah," he said, and his voice had the particular warmth of someone who was performing kindness for an audience. "How was the night?" "Quiet, thank God," Sarah said. Webb in 347 had a good night. Adjustment to the morphine protocol made all the difference. Brooke was moving past them now, ostensibly heading toward the supply room, but she felt it when Dr. Mercer's eyes landed on her. A weight. A pressure. The way a predator's attention shifts toward movement on the perimeter. "Who is that?" he asked Sarah, not bothering to lower his voice. Sarah glanced over. "Oh, that's Brooke. She's been with us about 8 months. Came from a military hospital background. Quiet. Competent. The patients like her." Brooke kept walking, her spine still bent slightly inward, her movements efficient and economical. Through the glass partition of room 347, she could see Webb's head turn slightly, as if he was listening to the conversation even though it was too far away for him to hear the words. He was listening for her voice. Even across the distance, across the years, across the gulf between who she had been and who she was pretending to be, he was listening for Captain Sullivan. In the supply room, Brooke replaced the empty 4-bag on the shelf and checked the inventory logs. The supply room was climate-controlled, neutral, a place where she could stand for 30 seconds and let the composure settle back into place. In her jacket pocket, her fingers found the unit patch again. She touched it once. Twice. A ritual. A tether. A reminder of the person she'd been the last time someone had looked at her and actually seen her. By the time she stepped back out into the hallway, Dr. Mercer had moved to the central station and was reviewing charts with the kind of focused attention that made everyone around him smaller. Sarah was nodding at whatever he was saying. The other nurses had straightened their posture, their voices dropping a half-octave out of pure instinct. "I've been reviewing the protocols," Brooke heard him say as she passed. "Too many nurses in this unit are making judgment calls that should be restricted to physicians. It's a matter of scope. It's a matter of hierarchy." He looked up then, and his eyes found her. They locked for exactly 1 second, the amount of time it took for him to see what he wanted to see. A nurse. Someone competent but ultimately replaceable. Someone quiet enough not to matter. Someone who knew her place. Brooke didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply acknowledged the look with the barest nod and continued toward the medication cart. The mask held. The composure was perfect. Behind her eyes, something sharp and surgical was taking inventory of everything it had observed about Dr. Marcus Mercer in that single second of contact. His wedding ring. His confidence. The particular angle of his chin that suggested he'd never been questioned by someone with nothing left to lose. She would remember that angle. Wednesday morning rounds at Cedar Creek Medical started the way they always did, fluorescent lights humming their surgical monotone, the ventilator in room 347 weaseling its mechanical rhythm, Dr. Mercer's voice carrying down the ICU corridor like authority itself had learned to speak. Brooke had been monitoring the blind Marine's post-operative vitals for 4 days now, watching the way his oxygen saturation climbed steadily, the way his wound site remained clean and properly perfused. His daughter had arrived Tuesday evening from Seattle, a woman with her father's jaw and her father's direct stare, and she sat beside his bed now, her hand resting on his tattooed arm, the one with her name inked there, the one Brooke had carried across 400 meters of Tikrit heat and gunfire that the daughter would never know about. The rounds procession moved like a surgical team through the unit, Mercer leading, 2 residents trailing, the charge nurse, and Brooke bringing up the end with the medication cart. They stopped at room 347. The daughter stood, her eyes on Mercer with that particular intensity of someone who loved the man in the bed and was not impressed by anyone else's credentials. Mercer launched into his standard assessment, his voice modulated for an audience, excellent post-operative trajectory, minimal complications, discharge planning for next week. Brooke listened to the oxygen settings, to the way the monitors told their story in beeps and numbers, and something in that data spoke to her in a language Mercer's credentials had never learned to read. She heard it in the subtle uptick of the patient's respiratory rate. She saw it in the slight elevation of his heart rate during what should have been a stable morning. For days of field medicine in Tikrit had taught her to read the body's whispers before they became screams, and this Marine was whispering something Mercer's morning rounds were missing entirely. "Doctor," Brooke said. Her voice came out quiet, measured, the way you speak when you've learned that volume proves nothing. "I'd recommend reviewing his post-op analgesic protocol. His vitals suggest he's experiencing more pain than the current morphine dosing is addressing. Increased respiratory rate, elevated heart rate during rest, pain markers that might progress his recovery timeline if left unmanaged." The room went dead silent. Mercer's face shifted through 3 distinct colors. The residents held their breath. The daughter leaned forward with sudden attention. Brooke's hand remained steady on the medication cart, her eyes fixed on the patient's chart, not on the man whose jaw was tightening like a fist. When Mercer spoke, his voice carried the precise diction of someone delivering a public execution of hierarchy. "Nurse Sullivan, your scope of practice ends where my medical degree begins. Perhaps you should focus on bedpans and leave complex surgical decisions to those who earned the credentials." He turned back to the daughter, his smile practiced and warm. "Please excuse the interruption. We'll continue our discussion in my office." Brooke took one measured breath. Let a single tear escape, not from sadness or fear, but from the accumulated weight of 8 months watching a patient she'd carried to safety years ago, watching him not know her, and now watching a man with letters after his name dismiss the only voice reading his body correctly. She wiped the tear without breaking eye contact with Mercer, her hand steady, her gaze holding his with the particular calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I've served under better men in worse places, Doctor." Her voice didn't waver. "This won't break me." Something flickered in Mercer's expression, not fear, exactly, but recognition that this wasn't the kind of nurse who would crumble under authority. He turned and continued rounds without responding, but his jaw remained set, and when he addressed her again, his voice carried a new nickname that drew snickers from the residents. "Captain Clipboard, could you adjust the 4 rate in room 342? The sarcasm was surgical precision itself. By Friday, the break room pattern was established like a law of physics. Brooke would sit down with her lunch at a sandwich she never finished, always eaten at exactly 12:36 p.m., always alone, and within 30 seconds, for nurses would gather their food and migrate to the lounge down the hall. The silence was the most cutting thing in the hospital. Not insults. Not confrontation. Just the sound of shoes on tile and the closing of distance, leaving her at a table meant for 8, eating at a table empty except for her hands and her resolve. She never looked up from the wall-mounted television playing muted news, never acknowledged the pattern, never flinched when the microwave door slammed a little harder than necessary on someone else's timing. On Monday, the laminated write-up appeared on the unit board at eye level, positioned where every staff member would see it during shift change. The words were precise, bureaucratic, devastating in their formality: incident report, insubordination and unauthorized medical judgment. Nurse B. Sullivan. Date of incident, 11/8. Witness, Dr. Chen, RN Martinez, patient family member. Summary: Nurse Sullivan provided unsolicited clinical recommendations during physician rounds, exceeding her scope of practice and undermining physician authority in front of patient family. Brooke read it once. Her finger traced the words unauthorized medical judgment while her other hand found the patch inside her jacket lining, faded unit colors, the Marine Corps emblem barely visible after years of being pressed against her skin. A junior resident whispered to another nearby, "Mercer's going to bury her." That afternoon, she sat in the blind Marine's room, reading his chart while the monitors hummed their steady rhythm around him. His oxygen saturation was holding at 96%. The respiratory rate had stabilized. His pain appeared managed. Whatever he'd been experiencing Wednesday morning was resolving, not because Mercer changed the protocol, but because sometimes the body heals itself, and sometimes the most important thing a nurse can do is simply witness that healing, even when the physician takes credit for it. "You okay, His voice came from the bed, that particular quality of concern that only a man who'd learned to read people without sight could develop. "You sound tired." "Just a long day, sir," Brooke replied, her voice never wavering even as her hand trembled slightly on the pen, the trembling not fear but restraint, the way metal holds itself together under pressure before it has to decide whether to bend or break. But that wasn't the worst part of what was coming. Thursday afternoon. 1:44 p.m. Cedar Creek Medical's OR-3 had the sterile smell of antiseptic and cold institutional purpose, the kind of smell that didn't change whether the procedure was routine or whether it was going to end someone's life. Brooke stood at the pre-op station reviewing the chart for the 100th time, her fingers tracking the sedation dosages, the intubation protocol, the baseline vitals for the blind Marine in room 347. Everything was documented. Everything was correct on paper. Everything was wrong in the way that only someone who had held a soldier's hand as his oxygen dropped to dangerous levels could recognize. Dr. Mercer had personally requested this assignment. "I want to ensure our celebrity patient gets the best care," he'd said during morning rounds, his tone dripping with sarcasm that made the junior residents shift uncomfortably. Brooke had watched his smile, the kind of smile a wolf gives before it tests the fence. He wasn't assigning himself to the bronchoscopy because the Marine needed the best care. He was assigning himself because Brooke was scheduled as the circulating nurse, and somewhere in the architecture of his resentment, he'd decided this procedure would be the moment he'd demonstrate his absolute control over her. She'd reviewed the sedation order 3 times. Propofol at 5 mg per kilogram, standard for a routine bronchoscopy, but something in the dosing sequence made her combat instinct scream. Not loud. Just a whisper in the back of her skull, the same whisper that had saved lives in field hospitals where there were no second opinions, no safety nets, no hierarchy to hide behind. But here at Cedar Creek, she had no authority to change a physician's order without triggering another confrontation with Mercer, without giving him another weapon in whatever campaign he was orchestrating. So she'd signed off on the medications and carried the chart into OR-3 at 1:43, watching as the surgical tech prepped the bronchoscope, as the anesthesiologist drew up the propofol, as the machinery of institutional medicine hummed its comfortable, dangerous routine. The Marine was already sedated when she entered, his blind eyes closed beneath the anesthesia, his arm, the one with her name tattooed across the bicep in that faded Tikrit script, resting at his side. Brooke positioned herself at the observation window, her eyes tracking his monitors, her body language the picture of a nurse doing a routine job. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. The trembling that wanted to move through her chest stayed locked behind muscle memory and discipline and the understanding that every tell, every flicker of emotion, could expose the mission that had cost 8 months of her life to establish. 1:45. Baseline saturation, 98%. Heart rate, 68. Respiratory rate, 18. Everything normal. Everything predictable. 1:49. The bronchoscope advanced through the endotracheal tube. Mercer's voice came through the intercom, clipped and professional, the authority of a man who'd spent 3 decades building an empire of deference. Brooke watched the scope image on the monitor, watching for inflammation, for infection, for anything that would require intervention. 1:47. Her eyes moved to the oxygen saturation trace on the monitor. 97. 96. Normal drift during procedures. 1:52. 94. Still within acceptable range. 1:58. 89. The number triggered something. Not panic. Never panic. But recognition. The kind of sharp animal awareness that comes from having seen oxygen numbers drop like this before, watched them fall past the point where intervention saves and into the territory where intervention only prolongs the dying. 2:12. The monitor's alarmed. His chest rose on the left side only. The right side stayed still, collapsed inward like a paper bag someone had wrung the air from. The oxygen saturation plummeted, 85, 79, 72, and the heart rate climbed, spiking past 120, past 140, the Marine's body registering what his sedated brain couldn't process. The air was trapped in his right pleural cavity, pressure building, the mediastinum beginning to shift, his heart being crushed from the inside out. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of emergency that killed people in perfect hospitals with perfect equipment because the moment between recognition and intervention was measured in blood oxygen levels and falling saturation numbers. "We've got a problem." Mercer's voice came through the intercom, steady but with an edge underneath it, the edge of a man who recognized he was watching his authority evaporate. He was fumbling with the crash cart, pulling drawers, calling for a chest tube setup, wasting seconds in the choreography of institutional panic. Brooke didn't ask permission. She didn't announce her intentions. She moved from the observation window to the bedside in 6 steps, muscle memory already finding the landmarks, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical gateway she'd used 100 times in Tikrit when there was no time for protocol, no time for hierarchy, only the binary choice between a patient breathing and a patient dead. 14-gauge needle, she said, and the surgical tech who had been standing frozen in confusion moved without question, extending the angiocath. Brooke's hands accepted it with the precision of someone for whom this procedure was as simple as tying shoes. She identified the space with 2 fingers, felt the inferior margin of the rib, positioned the needle perpendicular, and inserted it with one smooth motion, no hesitation, no second guessing, just the hiss of pressurized air escaping from the collapsed space. The sound was like releasing pressure from a tire, like the world exhaling after holding its breath. The Marine's chest rose. Both sides this time. The oxygen saturation monitors climbed, 78, 85, 91, 96, and the heart rate began to fall, the rhythm returning from panic to sinus, the equipment beeps settling into their normal rhythm. The room was silent except for the monitors. Nobody moved. The surgical tech was staring at her. The anesthesiologist was staring at her. Dr. Mercer was staring at her from his position across the operating table, and the expression on his face wasn't confusion or gratitude or any of the emotions that reasonable people feel when someone saves a life. It was humiliation, absolute and uncontained, the look of a man watching his authority crumble in real time, and underneath the humiliation was something darker, rage, the kind of cold institutional rage that doesn't scream but instead makes phone calls, calls in favors, activates networks. Where did she learn to do that? A surgical resident's voice, quiet, almost reverent. Mercer's response was ice. "Nurse Sullivan. My office. Now." She cleaned the blood from the needle site, just 3 drops, pink-tinged, smaller than the violence they represented. The surgical tech murmured, "That was incredible," and Brooke nodded once. No smile, no acknowledgement, just the neutral expression of someone doing her job. But her mind was already moving forward, already calculating. She'd just saved the Marine's life. She'd also just confirmed that she had knowledge she shouldn't possess, skills she couldn't explain, a level of composure under catastrophic medical emergency that nurses at Cedar Creek Medical didn't develop from standard training protocols and textbook procedures. She moved to the scrub sink and watched her hands under the running water, hands that had held wounds closed in desert tents, hands that had performed procedures that didn't have names because they were invented in the moment out of desperation and necessity. Pink-tinged water circled the drain, carrying away the blood, carrying away the pretense that she was just another nurse in just another hospital in just another city. The mission she'd been assigned 8 months ago, the careful infiltration of Cedar Creek to monitor a blind Marine whose case had triggered classified flags at Walter Reed, had just been compressed into a single moment of muscle memory and institutional emergency. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Dr. Mercer had watched her save a life and had already decided how he would make her pay for it. She dried her hands on the paper towel dispenser and walked toward his office, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, and the silence that followed her was the kind of silence that comes before everything changes. He made the calls within 48 hours. Dr. Mercer sat in his office with the door closed, his fingers moving across his phone's contact list like a predator selecting prey from a herd. First was Dr. Patricia Vance, a board member whose son he'd personally championed for a prestigious residency 3 years ago, a favor she had not forgotten. "Patricia, I need a discreet conversation about one of our nursing staff. Credential irregularities." "Yes, I'm certain. Call you back within the hour." The second call went to Martin Cho, the hospital's legal counsel, a man whose malpractice deposition Mercer had covered during a scandal 2 years prior. Martin owed him. Everyone owed him something. "Martin, we have a situation. A nurse with a fabricated employment history." "No, I'm not exaggerating. I'll need you to expedite a full credential review. Can you have preliminary findings by Friday? The third call was the most calculated. Rebecca Torres was a former hospital administrator who now specialized in exposing fraudulent nursing licenses. She had a reputation for surgical precision in dismantling false credentials. Mercer sent her Brooke's entire employment file, including the Pentagon routing center numbers that had verified her dates but nothing else, numbers that Torres would instantly recognize as suspicious, as classified, as deliberately opaque. Rebecca, I'm sending you documentation now. Look at those verification contacts. Something's wrong. I need this fast. By Friday morning, the preliminary report had landed in the HR director's inbox. Rebecca Torres's assessment was clinical and devastating, significant irregularities in employment verification. Federal contact numbers ring to routing centers with no direct staff listing. Previous hospital records do not align with timeline gaps. Recommend credential suspension pending full investigation. Potential credential falsification cannot be ruled out. Not provable. Not legally airtight. Perfect. The kind of accusation that required no proof, only the appearance of legitimacy. The termination meeting was scheduled for 1,100 hours in Conference Room B on the second floor. Brooke arrived to find Dr. Mercer already seated, his posture relaxed, almost satisfied. The nursing director sat across from him, uncomfortable. An HR representative with a prepared document faced the empty chair. Brooke sat down slowly, her hands folding themselves on the table with the same precision she used for everything else. The HR representative read from the script like someone delivering a eulogy, effective immediately. Your employment at Cedar Creek Medical is terminated for credential irregularities, multiple violations of professional scope, and insubordination. Security will escort you from the premises. Mercer's face was a study in barely concealed triumph. His eyes held hers for exactly 2 seconds, the look of a man who had successfully executed a plan. Brooke didn't ask for mercy. Didn't demand explanations. Didn't even raise her voice. She asked only to, may I return my scrubs personally? I would prefer not to mail them. The HR representative, relieved by her composure and perhaps uncomfortable with Mercer's obvious satisfaction, nodded. Security arrived within 5 minutes, 2 officers who treated her with the kind of professional neutrality reserved for people who might cause a scene. They didn't. She didn't. The walk through the ICU happened at shift change, the moment when maximum staff would be present. Brooke had not chosen this timing, security had decided it. But the effect was calculated regardless. Nurses she had trained, nurses she had helped through their first codes, nurses she had covered for when they made mistakes, they suddenly became very interested in their vital sign monitors. The break room pattern had prepared them well. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody waved. Nobody acknowledged the woman walking out of their department for the last time. The blind Marine was in imaging. Room 347 stood empty, its bed freshly stripped by housekeeping, the monitors silent. She didn't allow her eyes to linger. 8 months of surveillance. 8 months of standing at his bedside, reading his vitals in a voice he would never recognize, carrying a classified mission that would now go incomplete. The patient who had tattooed her name on his arm in gratitude for saving his life would never know that the nurse who'd just walked out was the reason he'd survived Tikrit. That was the trade she'd made when she accepted this assignment, invisibility in exchange for access. Her rock bottom came that evening in the laundry room of Cedar Creek Medical. A basement space that smelled of industrial bleach and the sharp sting of steam rising from pressed linens. She had asked to return her scrubs personally, a small thing, a final grasp at control, and the hospital's laundry supervisor had granted it without question. The room was empty except for the 2 of them. The supervisor, a woman named Elena who had worked there for 17 years, pretended not to notice when Brooke began folding. Each crease was exact. Each fold was deliberate. The blue fabric moved beneath her hands the way it had in Tikrit, the way it had on the day she'd folded a flag over the transfer case of a Marine she couldn't save. Muscle memory and ritual and the kind of precise repetition that comes from having done it too many times before. The scrubs felt like paper in her hands, insubstantial, temporary. All of it had been temporary. The cover. The identity. The job that was supposed to be simple: watch the patient, report upward, wait for extraction. 8 months. And now it was ending in a basement laundry room in Denver at 18:47 hours on a Friday evening. Elena said, "You were a good nurse." "I'm sorry." It was the kind of kindness that made things worse. Brooke nodded. Once. She couldn't trust her voice, and voice was all she had left. She reached for the faded unit patch inside her jacket, the one that had ridden against her ribs for 8 months, the one the blind Marine had grabbed when his fingers found something solid in the chaos of incoming fire, the one that had kept her tethered to who she actually was while she wore the mask of someone else. She pulled the jacket off, held the patch in her hands, and looked at it for the first time since Tikrit. The colors had faded from constant contact with her skin. The embroidered edges had started to fray. It looked like what it was, a piece of something already gone. She placed it in the pocket of her scrubs, then reconsidered. Pulled the jacket back on. Tucked the patch back against her ribs where it had been since the beginning. The scrubs went into the laundry basket Elena held out, and Brooke walked toward the loading dock exit where no one from the hospital would see her leave, where no one would witness the moment her composure finally broke. The parking garage was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous rhythm. She sat in her vehicle at 18:47 hours and stared at her phone for 8 minutes before moving. The encrypted messaging app opened with a biometric unlock, fingerprint, face recognition, voice pattern. She typed, "Cover blown. Asset unprotected. Mission failed." The cursor blinked. She almost sent it. Instead she deleted the message, character by character, and drove home in silence that seemed to have weight. 7 days passed like hours. Brooke sent her final encrypted report, 8 months of surveillance data, medical observations about the blind Marine's recovery trajectory, his psychological state, nothing about how he'd survived those 400 meters in Tikrit because she had carried him. The Pentagon Routing Center sent back 3 words to await further instruction. The instruction never came. On day 4 she packed the go bag that stayed under her bed for assignments like this, the bag that contained cash, false identification, a Glock 19 with a suppressor, and the kind of documents that don't officially exist. On day 8, she stopped checking her phone. And that's when the system found her. Cedar Creek Medical's IT department ran a routine background check integration with the VA system on Thursday morning, a new software protocol, mandated by federal insurance requirements, that linked veteran patient records with staff security clearance databases for automatic verification. It was supposed to be seamless. Automated. Invisible. The system pinged at 0923 hours when Brooke Sullivan's file triggered a classified clearance alert. Not a minor flag. Not a routine inquiry. A high-level defense intelligence designation that activated a chain of protocol notification starting at the VA and routing upward to Walter Reed, then to the Pentagon, then to Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico. The hospital administrator received a call at 1347 hours from a defense intelligence liaison whose name he was not given and whose office location he could not identify. "You have an employee named Brooke Sullivan, RN, assigned to ICU," the voice said. Not a question. Confirm her current status and location immediately. The administrator checked the system and said she was terminated 8 days ago. Credential irregularities. Why? The liaison said, "Stay in your office. Do not discuss this call with anyone. We are sending personnel." 40 minutes. Then the line went dead. Dr. Mercer was in his office when security informed him that the conference room had been classified as a restricted access facility and that he was to remain available. He demanded answers from 3 different administrators and received none. By 1600 hours, he was watching federal agents, civilian clothes, military bearing, the kind of presence that makes the air pressure change, begin setting up communications equipment in conference room B. He knew, in the way predators know when they've made a mistake with something higher on the food chain, that his victory had just become something else entirely. The conference room was standing room only by 1700 hours. Hospital board members. Senior medical staff. Dr. Mercer near the front, his crossed arms the only thing holding his composure together. 23 people watching security agents position themselves at the exits like this was protocol rather than something unprecedented. Then Brooke Sullivan was escorted into the room by 2 individuals in civilian clothes, and the noise stopped. She was different. The hospital nurse, deferential, quiet, accepting insults in silence, was gone. In her place was someone whose presence occupied space like an apex predator occupies terrain. Her spine was straight. Her eyes were clear and moving with tactical assessment, cataloging exits, counting hostile civilians, identifying threats. She wore jeans and a simple dark jacket, nothing military, nothing overt, and everything about her screamed it anyway. Then they brought in the blind Marine. He was wheeled by a VA hospital staffer, his sun-darkened face turning toward the sound of movement. His hand reached out before he could see anything, the gesture of someone learning the world through touch. Brooke moved closer. His fingers found her wrist first, then her face, tracing the line of her jaw with the precision of someone reading Braille, and his breath caught. "Valkyrie," he whispered, and his voice carried the weight of 8 years. "I'd know that voice anywhere. You were there. In Tikrit. You carried me." The room erupted. Not loud. Shocked. The kind of murmur that comes when reality rewrites itself in real time. A Marine colonel in dress blues stood, unfolded a citation with hands that trembled slightly, and read in a voice that cracked with genuine emotion, "Captain Brooke Sullivan, United States Marine Corps, is hereby recognized for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against enemy forces in Tikrit, Iraq. Under sustained enemy fire, Captain Sullivan personally carried 3 wounded Marines across 400 meters of open terrain to the medevac landing zone, sustaining shrapnel wounds while maintaining tactical command and continuing to provide medical assessment to all personnel under fire." 90 seconds of absolute silence. The kind of silence that comes when ordinary people are confronted with someone who has lived in territories they cannot imagine. The last person to enter was a 2-star general in Marine dress uniform. The room snapped to attention like a trigger had been pulled. He walked directly to the table where Brooke's decorations had been displayed: Silver Star, 2 bronze stars with Valor, Purple Heart, unit citations, and he saluted them with a kind of precision that was itself a form of prayer. Then he turned to Dr. Mercer. "Captain Sullivan's code name and operational parameters are classified above top secret. She was embedded in this facility under deep cover, monitoring a high-value asset for defense intelligence operations. You terminated her mid-mission, compromised a classified surveillance operation, and exposed a national security asset to hostile intelligence vectors." The general's voice was quiet. Conversational almost. "That was poor judgment, Doctor." Dr. Mercer's mouth opened and closed like something mechanical losing power. The blind Marine held up his tattooed arm, showing Brooke's name written in ink over his skin. She pulled the faded unit patch from her jacket, the one that had ridden against her ribs for 8 months, and placed it in his hand. The patch he had grabbed in Tikrit. The patch that had kept him tethered when he was bleeding out. The same patch she had folded with military precision in a laundry room 3 hours after being fired, when the world still thought she was just a nurse. 7 days passed like a held breath. Brooke filled them with silence, the kind that comes from people who've learned not to exist in rooms where they're not wanted. She'd cleaned the apartment. She'd run. She'd stood in the shower at 3 in the morning letting hot water run cold while she catalogued every variable of the failed operation. 8 months of embedded surveillance. 400 meters under fire. A Marine whose name was tattooed on his arm because she decided he mattered more than protocol. And she'd lost him anyway, not to enemy fire but to a surgeon's ego and a system that couldn't see what it was burning. The call came on day 8. Her phone, the classified one, the Pentagon number buried in her secure contacts, didn't ring. It buzzed twice. Once meant routine update. Twice meant move now. She didn't ask questions. She answered on the first pulse. "Captain Sullivan." A woman's voice. Clinical. Your employment file triggered a clearance integration during a routine VA system audit. Cedar Creek Medical's hospital administrator just received a call requesting verification of your employment history. That call was routed to our office, not theirs. Brooke's jaw tightened. She understood what that meant. Someone in that hospital had just tried to verify the credentials of a defense intelligence operative, and the request had pinged the Pentagon. There's a briefing room on the 3rd floor of the Lowry building downtown, the voice continued. 1400 hours. You'll recognize the attendees. Come dressed for work. This is not optional. The line went dead. Brooke sat on the edge of her bed. She'd been fired. Compromised. Burned. Everything she'd been tasked to protect was supposed to stay hidden. And now the Pentagon was calling her back to collect the pieces. She put on her scrubs. The Lowry building was federal architecture, all concrete and windows that didn't open, security protocols layered so deep you could taste them in the air. 3 floors underground, the briefing room smelled like stale coffee and the metallic tang of nervous security clearances. She walked in at 1,359 hours. The room was standing room only. 15 people at minimum. Military. Intelligence. Someone from NCIS by the bearing. Medical personnel she didn't recognize. And in a wheelchair positioned at the head of the table, wearing a marine dress blue uniform that seemed too large for his frame, was the blind Marine from room 347. The room went absolutely still. His hand rose before she took another step. Not searching. Reaching. Like he'd been waiting for the exact moment she would walk through that door, like he'd been counting the distance the way sighted men count to targets. His fingers found her face, her cheekbone, her temple, with the precision of someone reading a map written in muscle and bone. Valkyrie. His voice cracked like someone had been waiting 8 years to say it. I'd know that voice anywhere. Brooke didn't move. Her training said freeze. Her instinct said fall apart. She did neither. She stood exactly where she was while the Marine touched her face like she was a ghost he needed to confirm was real, and the room bore witness to whatever had happened between them that was too classified to explain. A Marine colonel stepped forward. His uniform was dress blues. His ribbon rack was long enough that it belonged on someone who'd attended someone else's funerals. He opened a leather folder and began to read. Captain Brooke Sullivan. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Tikrit, Iraq, 2016 to 2017. His voice was measured. Practiced at delivering words that carried weight. Citation for Valor. On March 15, 2016, while assigned to a joint task force in Jolan District, Captain Sullivan identified 3 wounded Marines pinned by enemy fire across an open kill zone. Rather than wait for casualty evacuation, she exfiltrated the position under sustained small arms fire, moving 3 combatants across 400 meters of exposed terrain while suppressing enemy fire herself. The colonel's voice trembled. These Marines are alive because Captain Sullivan made the choice to run toward the guns instead of away from them. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for authorization. She evaluated the situation and saved lives. Brooke was looking at the blind Marine. His hand had fallen from her face but his head was turned toward her, like he was still seeing her somehow. Bronze Star. The colonel continued. Silver Star. A longer pause. 2 Purple Hearts. And the Navy Cross, the highest decoration for valor in combat short of the Medal of Honor itself. The room was so quiet you could hear the air filtration system humming in the ceiling tiles. Then the doors at the rear opened and a 2-star general walked in. Not casually. The way generals walk, like they're carrying the weight of decisions that cost lives, and they've made peace with it, and they don't need anyone's approval to do it again. He looked at Brooke. He saluted. Hand to chest, the kind of gesture that only happens when the person you're acknowledging has earned something beyond rank. Then he turned to Dr. Mercer, who had pushed through the crowd at the back of the room. How he'd gotten in, Brooke would learn later, was a security failure that would trigger 3 internal investigations. "This is absurd," Mercer said. His voice was shaking with the kind of rage that only comes from a man watching his carefully constructed hierarchy collapse. "She's just a... Captain Sullivan's code name is above your clearance level, Doctor," the general said. His voice was polite. Soft, even. Which was worse. "And you just terminated a defense intelligence asset mid-operation. That's a federal crime. We're still evaluating whether to prosecute." Mercer's face went the color of old bone. 24 hours later, a video compilation went live on a military advocacy YouTube channel. 47 seconds of footage pulled from Cedar Creek Medical's internal security system. Dr. Mercer in the break room calling her Captain Clipboard while the staff laughed. The formal write-up posted on the unit board. Security escorting Brooke out of the hospital while Mercer watched from his office window, small and satisfied. The video titled itself, "They Fired the Hero Protecting You." 2,300,000 views in 18 hours. Comments flooding in from former residents, nurses, patients describing a pattern: Mercer's contempt, his weaponization of credentials, his systematic destruction of anyone whose competence threatened his authority. The Department of Defense issued a statement confirming that Captain Sullivan had been conducting a classified security operation and had performed her duties with distinction. On day 10, Dr. Harrison Chambers, the Johns Hopkins surgical legend who had written Mercer's letter of recommendation, who had launched his entire career, released a public statement. "I am appalled and ashamed. His actions represent everything I fought against in academic medicine: the worship of hierarchy over competence, the abuse of power over collaborative care. I hereby publicly disown any professional association with him." The hospital board's emergency session lasted for hours. By day 11, Mercer was offered resignation in lieu of termination. He refused. He called in favors, made threats, tried to weaponize the same network that had carried him upward. One by one, they stopped answering. By day 17, he was gone. 6 weeks later, Brooke stood in the newly renovated ICU of Cedar Creek Medical. The sign above the nurse's station read Captain Brooke Sullivan Veterans Care Unit. Her photograph hung in a case, desert camouflage, carrying a wounded Marine, her face locked in the expression of someone making a choice that costs everything. The faded unit patch she'd sewn inside her jacket lining was framed beside it, backlit and preserved like it deserved to be. The blind Marine sat in a wheelchair next to her. His arm was extended, the tattoo visible, her name, and below it, the date. March 15, 2016. The day she decided he mattered more than the mission, more than protocol, more than the cost. He held his other arm up to show her what had been added. A new tattoo, inked at Landstuhl during his recovery. The same unit patch. And beside it, the words, "Valkyrie brought me home." Brooke reached out and touched the patch like she was confirming it was real. "You staying this time, Captain?" or the Marine asked. She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that comes from someone who's learned to live in the spaces between words. "I'm home, Corporal," she said. "Not going anywhere." That same morning, across Denver, a medical supply van pulled up to the loading dock of a nursing facility in Aurora. The driver was Dr. Mercer. His medical license was still active. No hospital would touch him. No private practice would have him. His name had become a case study in ethics seminars, the cautionary tale of what happens when ego matters more than competence. He delivered oxygen tanks and hospital beds. He signed paperwork. He existed in the margins of a profession he'd once commanded, and nobody looked at him twice. By evening, Brooke was teaching a group of nursing students proper needle decompression technique in the Captain Brooke Sullivan Veterans Care Unit. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this under fire, in dust storms, with people screaming. The students watched like they were learning not just medicine but something closer to faith, the kind that comes from seeing competence married to courage. The blind Marine watched from his bed, his hand resting on the framed unit patch, and when Brooke glanced over, he was smiling. Because the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you're watching this and you work in healthcare, in the military, or anywhere else that demands excellence in the dark, I want you to know something: your value isn't measured in credentials or titles or how loud you are in the room. It's measured in lives you touch when nobody's watching. So if you've got a story like Brooke's, if you know someone who's quietly saving the world in a uniform or scrubs or both, share this video. Like it. Subscribe. And drop a comment telling us about a hero you know who nobody realizes is a hero. Because the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together.